discussing the book Shackleton by Ranulph Fiennes. It's a biography about Ernest Shackleton, a polar explorer around the turn of the 20th century. He was very prominent in trying to reach the South Pole, and then did a couple of other things along those lines. There are four main factors I took away from this book. Number one is that polar exploration, at least back then, was really all about boosting people's egos. And as much as maybe you might think that today that sounds a bit weird and maybe useless, you have to understand the times that these people were living in and how honor and national pride and all these things played in their favor, and that's how exploration was driven. It's a little bit different today. There's the attempt to try to compare Shackleton with people like Elon Musk today, or Bezos, or these types of people who are trying to explore, let's say, space or go to Mars and things like that. And I think the comparison is very, very, very different. Because second, most importantly, I think the reason Shackleton failed in my book, he failed, is because he was really just an explorer, and he didn't think about the supply chain, the technology it takes from physics and technology and engineering all the way to actually human intelligence and leadership qualities. He didn't think about all those things through when creating these explorations, and that's why he failed and actually cost people's lives. And I think third, my takeaway here is that you have you often have the question of what drives people, right? And in the case of Shackleton, it was clearly Ranulph Fiennes, who himself is an explorer, portrays him as an egomaniac. Even though he doesn't mention it, he definitely portrays him like that. And I don't know if that was intentional or not, but it comes across like he's a man driven by his ego and obsessed with his ego, and he really drives people all the way to the end, which has positive aspects, meaning he was able to survive an incredible catastrophe that could have cost everybody's lives. He was able to survive that and get through it, and his famous rescue of men who were stranded in the ice, and then later on an island in the South Pacific, in a freezing island in South Georgia, which is a freezing cold place, is a very important, I think, achievement. But nevertheless, I think he was driven by strong ego and those sort of things. And I think actually I want to add a fourth thing, which I forgot in the prelude here, and that is one of the striking things about this whole story is actually the fact that there were Norwegian whalers all the way down in the south. And here's why this is so important to me, because I've been following Norway as an investment thesis for years in my early days at Orange Capital Partners. And I was wondering, why are these people so good at offshore drilling and oil, and why are they so obsessed with natural resources? And the answer is, it's been in the history of the country. They've been whaling and sealing for centuries, probably even before new modern technologies came up, and they just have that in their DNA. And I think that's a really important takeaway, that sometimes it's important to understand countries. It's important to understand the culture of countries and the DNA that ties people together. And there is such a thing as a nation and a culture within a nation. And that's just something that I always intuitively knew, but it kind of dawned to me reading this book. This is a Not Even Wrong podcast. It's February 21st, 2023. This is Krim Delco. For the day, the fund is down 10.6%. The market's down 2%. For the year, we are up 61.4%. The market's up 4.3%. We're outperforming by 57.1%. Just before I go into the discussion of Shackleton, the biography of the explorer, let me spend a few words on the market situation. I think we have a toxic mix of macro news that came our way in the last couple of days. We had a higher than expected CPI and PPI numbers recently. We have a creep up of the 10-year treasury now at 3.95% or something, 3.9, almost 4%. It was 3.6 not long ago. So the 10-year is creeping up again. The short term is kind of holding in the 5% range, which is what is expected from the Fed. But what we saw is recently actually a flattening of the inversion of the yield curve. And that's an interesting situation because we can think about this in two ways. On one is the negative, which is, well, we have the 10-year rates going up. That is bad news for long-term rates, for mortgages, auto loans. Everything is going to be more expensive. Demand is going to come down. Or we could have it the other way, which is kind of what my partner Zoe and I thought this morning in the morning meeting or our morning walk, which is kind of our morning meeting. She said that, well, I think what people are doing is selling treasuries and buying equities. And that's a good news because we have a flattening of the yield curve. We have growth expectations coming back into the market. And that's a good thing. Now, I think the truth with yield curve is always, there's an old saying that the yield curve has predicted 10 of the last 7 recessions. So what that means is that we have a signal here which sometimes is right and sometimes is wrong. It's not exactly the broken clock that is always right twice a day. It's not that bad, but I think you can take the yield curve a little bit more seriously than that. But nevertheless, you have to be clear about the fact that you could be looking at a signal that sometimes is right and sometimes is wrong. How do we think about this? We think that the inflation ghost is not gone yet. It is disappearing, but it's not gone yet. And the reason we think that is for 3 reasons. One is we don't see enough pain in the labor market. There's still people going around and, at least attempting to work from home, at least verbally, even though they're not doing it anymore. I think people are actually showing up to work now. You can see it in the traffic, let's say here in Silicon Valley. It's unbearable. So clearly people are going to work, even though they're still sort of mentally at least thinking that maybe I can work only 3 days a week instead of 5, those sort of things. Second, also related to that, the labor market on the sort of blue collar side, we haven't heard much about it, but clearly that is also getting better. So that's a good news. But it's not pain enough in the sense that we don't hear layoffs at blue collar shops like, let's say, Walmart or places like that. So we're not at that stage. Maybe we don't even have to get to that stage. But we've always said that the main problem of inflation, it's not monetary, it is political. People have to go back to work. People have to be forced to pay their bills. That's the only way we will get back to some sort of normalcy in the economy. I think second, we have deflationary pressures in the economy, clearly started by Tesla lowering their prices and then proliferating through the car industry, and we see that in many other industries. But for some reason, we had a higher CPI and PPI print. So how do we reconcile that? I think there's 2 ways to reconcile this. One is there's lagging effects in the PPI and CPI. That's what most people are saying. Or we have other aspects such as the energy markets, for example, which are still not loosening. And I think that, to the third point, I think we're forgetting that oil and other energy products are still very expensive. And that is unfortunately a reason why inflation is at least not going to abate as fast as we hope. So what does that all mean? I think the way we see the market from a Fed perspective, meaning the financial market, is that the Fed will be definitely on alert for much longer than we think, because they want to eradicate the monetary side of inflation, which is all the good stuff about expectations and inflation expectations and all of that stuff. But more importantly, that way they can also force the political side of things, which is where the actual inflation really happens, to start moving, which is, like we said many times, and we've written essays about this, that inflation is a political phenomenon. It's not a monetary phenomenon. It is about things like labor laws, zoning laws, particularly, but then many other institutional frameworks that need to be in place for a free, lubricated economy to function, because demand and supply will find its way at decent prices if we don't meddle too much in the economy. Government is the problem, not the solution. And by having tight monetary conditions, we force the government to become more lenient with the economy, and particularly also the government itself being the main actually reason for inflation, because they hire people and waste money on government funded projects. We need to undo that, and the best way to undo that is by high rates. So those are good news. We expect short-term pain, 2 quarters, and then a relaxation of the economy. The market will anticipate. That's why we had rally in the market. We anticipate that to continue, even though maybe in the next couple of weeks we will have some bumps. Um, we have to embrace that. Volatility is part of the equation, like we said many times at Orange Capital Partners. But we're very comfortable with Tesla as an investment thesis, and we're looking forward to the Investor Day coming next week. So now let's talk about this book. Ernest Shackleton, he's a polar explorer around the turn of the 19th to 20th century, British, actually Irish, but within the British Empire, functioning within that context. And like I said, there's these four big takeaways. I think number one, these people were driven by, he was an egomaniac, and quite frankly, he was an incompetent egomaniac, which was driving people to their death and wasting money. And I think Ranulph Fiennes finds he himself is an explorer, a contemporary explorer of polar, of polar geography. He kind of puts it that way in a very polite way. So he's a very good writer, actually. I have to say he's not as good as a biographer as, let's say, the person that wrote Hamilton, which is the sort of the gold standard for biographies. But like I said many times in this podcast, I like the way that he writes this book in an interesting way. And to me, there's no such thing as biographies and novels and all that stuff. Everything is just a story. And the more interesting you can tell the story, the better you capture the audience. And I don't really care if it's true or not, to be honest. What I care about is what is the depth of the story, and is it a good narrative? And this is actually a pretty good job. He did a pretty good job. It's a good story. I mean, it's a good story. There's this guy, comes from nowhere, he's Irish, but in the British Empire, fights all the typical institutional barriers that you have to overcome as a sort of non-member of the elite. He has to overcome institutional barriers of Victorian England or post-Victorian England. And then he actually succeeds. He raises funds and he's able to go and explore the South Pole. Now let's put this in context of the turn of the 20th century, where Britain is sort of on the decline, but it's still a great empire, and exploring new continents is still part of the national psyche, and he is part of that, and he's driving that forward. His explorations are, I would say, all of them are a failure, but within the failure, he's able to save his men's lives through heroic actions. I mean, I can give away the plot here because it's known. They end up being stranded with their ship in pack ice. The ship gets lost. They have to then survive on the boats, on the lifeboats, and walk through ice, and then use the lifeboats in a sea of 50 to 100-foot waves to get to an island called South Georgia Island, which is a long way and really well written by Fiennes. I think he has this knack for adventure writing. I guess he's an adventurer himself. And then eventually he survives and saves his men. There's another part of the story where some people die, and it's unfortunate. And I think in the end he dies in South Georgia Island, which is another interesting twist of the plot, where he survives all this terrible misfortunes, ends up getting to South Georgia Island, gets rescued by a Norwegian whaling crew, then gets back to England, starts a new exploration, goes back to South Georgia Island to launch from there to the South Pole, and then dies on the island, which is kind of just an interesting twist of the plot. But again, I think this being driven by egomania, or whatever the word is, it's part of the game. And I think you kind of you lean towards trying to compare him to today's big men, like let's say Elon Musk, and you have to ask yourself, is he driven by the same types of egotisms and things like that? And to some extent, yes, but I think the times are different. I think Musk is not the same. And the main difference between Musk and this guy, and this is the second thing, which is incredibly important, is that when you do these big things, you can't just stand up, raise money, and then say, I'm going to do it. I have this urge to do it, and so on and so forth. You have to think through the supply chain. You have to carefully design your project in a way where where it has a chance to succeed. You have to build a purpose ship. Maybe you have to build purposeful technology, like heating technology, sleeping bag technology. Whatever it is you can do within the confines of your technological period. You have to think about it, and you can't just buy off-the-shelf stuff. And that's what this guy did. And that makes me think that he really is an incompetent type of guy, because he's not thinking through this deeply enough, or he doesn't even care about it. That's the problem. And to me, I feel like that with Jeff Bezos, let's say, when it comes to the Mars race between him and Musk. He just wants to win that race. I feel like that there's many of examples. Like I'm very skeptical, let's say, of Sam Altman, CEO of OpenAI, because I feel like OpenAI and Altman are just driven by vanity. They just want to be relevant in Silicon Valley at all costs. And they're not really thinking through the technology, what it actually takes. There's a massive semantic gap between their visions and what they actually do, which is, and the semantic gap that is, I borrow this from computer architecture. It's the gap between, let's say, a programmer and the actual physics on the hardware. Or in other words, you have a certain vision, a certain problem you want to solve, and then you have to bring it down all the way to the physics of how to do it. I think every endeavor in life is like that. You have a certain vision. It starts with an idea, and that's great. But then you have to close that semantic gap between idea and actual physics and actual engineering. And people like Elon Musk, they start with the vision, but then they start from the bottom also at the same time and think, okay, what's possible and how can we make it happen? And they really, truly think deeply about these technical engineering problems to close that semantic gap. And people like Ernest Shackleton, Sam Altman, Jeff Bezos, they don't think like that. And that's a very important, subtle, but very important difference between people like Elon Musk and Shackleton and all the others I just mentioned. The third point, and this comes back to the second, which is, okay, what drives people? In other words, okay, what is a leader you want to follow? What drives people? And again, very subtle here. Yeah, everybody's driven by some sort of ego, right? We need to have an ego to even be driven by something. But forget the ego part for a second. I think in the end, the kind of leader you want to follow is the guy or the lady that expresses love. Love in a maybe a bit broader sense, in a Dostoevsky sense. Okay, love, not just the interpersonal love, but love for the science, love for the cause. I feel like Musk expresses that. He has that love. You might disagree with me, but you feel like he genuinely loves what he does. And you don't feel like that with Shackleton. You don't feel like that with, let's say, again, the examples I used, Altman or Bezos and Gates and so on and so forth. I have a feeling Walt Disney was like that. And in his biography, it doesn't come across enough, but I feel like there was a love for what he did. That's why he created the Disney company. I have a feeling Edison was like that. I have a feeling Ford was like that. Yes, some of them went crazy, but at some point in their lives, but they had that love for, even Rockefeller had that. Something. Maybe love is the wrong word. It's not obsession. Shackleton was obsessed, but there was no love there. It was all just matter of fact, get there first, be in the record books. It was all about records, all about, I want to be first, I want to be that guy, I want to be this guy. It's all fine, you can't compete, but where is the love? Where's your niche? Where are you evolving your own little niche? Why are you just elbowing and rat racing with others? So that's a subtle difference that I think is important for the investment process. Let's not forget the purpose of this podcast series is to give people a sense what it feels like to run a hedge fund. So why do we discuss these types of books? Because we try to relate them to our business. And that's one very good example. I think the fourth point I want to take from this book, which is really, really important also, which is, so in this book, there is the scene where he rescues himself after he's stranded, that she lost his ship and he's on the lifeboats and he's in this terrible South Sea, cold, huge waves, ice, winds, gales, all that kind of stuff. And then he ends up on South Georgia Island. And who's there? There's a Norwegian whaling post on South Georgia Island. Now, Ranulph Fiennes just sort of mentions that just the Norwegians are there. We're talking 1914. There's Norwegian whalers in the South Sea. Now, for me as a hedge fund manager, this is a lot more important because when I studied Norway as an investor, I went there, I traveled there, I spoke to people, all that kind of stuff. I sometimes scratched my head and I thought, why are these people so obsessed with offshore drilling and natural resources? And I thought, well, it's just they have oil there and that's why they do these things, right? But, the Germans have oil, the Brits have oil, the Norwegian, I mean, the Spanish have oil. I mean, Algeria has oil and gas. Why are the Norwegians so obsessed with it and so successful at it? And then when you read these types of books and then you learn about these little tidbits. Okay, well, there were Norwegians in 1914 in one of the harshest environments on earth. Still is, but back then this must have been triple harsh. Okay, you have no cable, no wireless, no phone, no radar, no nothing. And you're in that terrible sea with gales and winds and glaciers, and it's cold and freezing, and you have these people hunting for whales, for whale oil, and hunting for seals because they had furs which were valuable. It just shows you the DNA of those people. And there's a scene in my biography, my memoirs, where I write about our first sort of couple of years at Orange Capital Partners, me and Zovinar. And what we did is very interesting in hindsight. We started thinking about the world in geographies. So we thought, we went to Norway and we analyzed Norway as a country, and not necessarily like everybody else on Wall Street analyze, let's say, mining companies or consumer goods companies. We looked at the world very culturally. And we went to Chile. We did the same thing. We went to Colombia. We went to China. And sometimes that's futile, right? Analyzing oil companies in Colombia really is not very different than analyzing oil companies in Brazil, and so on and so forth. But I think when it comes to the 0 to 1 type investing, when you really want to find the subtle differences between the people that make money and those that don't, which are often very subtle, if you want to close that semantic gap that investors are exposed to, I think it really helps to look at the world from a cultural perspective. And there's a sentence in my book that I think is so important. If you want to be different, then have a different map. Look where nobody else is looking. And I think this is a nice example of, we started with Norway, which was the first country we visited with that new fund structure, me and Zovinar being on our own, managing money and all that. And I think it was very, very helpful, actually. We ended up making money. The reason we made money is because we went to Norway in the summer of 2008. And I will never forget, we met Yara, which is a company that does fertilizer. And we met in that meeting, nothing made sense. And Zovinar got very upset at the person, the CFO that we spoke with, because she felt like he's selling us snake oil. And after the meeting, we were strolling down the streets of Oslo, and then we concluded that this makes no sense. Again, this is summer of 2008. Oil is too expensive. This whole country makes no sense. They're all crazy here. And we started buying puts on oil. Oil was about $100 a barrel. We closed that position about 4 months later when oil was $35 a barrel. So why am I telling these stories? Please don't take this the wrong way. I'm not bragging about making money. We lost a lot of money but in that same trip. We bought, let's say, shares of a company called Black Earth Farming, a Swedish agricultural company that was doing business in the Ukraine. We lost money on that trade. We lost lots of money on other trades. What I'm trying to say here is a lot more subtle. It is that when you go and you do things in a different way, you will find opportunities. And they often come from unexpected corners. And it's the job of an investor to be ready when they come and strike. And this is really important. So to summarize, now let's get back to the Shackleton biography. It's a great book. I think kudos to Ranulph Fiennes for this great book. Thank you. I think Ernest Shackleton as a person is not worth it. He's in my view, an egomaniac, incompetent. He missed some of the crucial aspects of what it takes to really be doing great things and new things. And that is, you have to think about the whole supply chain, not just wanting to do it, not just being driven by vanity. We apply this to today. We feel like, let's say, again, people like OpenAI, Sam Altman, CEO of OpenAI, is similar to that. Jeff Bezos, to some extent, with his Mars exploration. That's why we're not interested in those types of innovations. I think the question of what drives people came up. And like I said, our conclusion is you want to look for love in what drives leaders and not just vanity. That's very important. And I think, like I said, lastly, but not least, for sure, the importance of finding these tidbits and understanding the culture and the DNA of countries or societies, of people, is you can't underestimate that. And in this book, it comes across in this small tidbit that there were Norwegians stationed in the South Sea, and they actually helped Shackleton to survive one of his biggest catastrophes. But again, that's not the point. The point is that they were even there. That in itself is a very interesting aspect of the book. And again, I think it's a good example of a book that is worth reading. It's conditioning of the mind. You learn about these great endeavors in the past. You can draw your own conclusions, but you certainly learn something, and this is the key, and this is the purpose of reading. Thank you.